Hello again! I'm here today to discuss a character that I feel is often misunderstood by many, one Cinder Fall, specifically relating to her capabilities as a villain. But first, a big thank you to my wonderful patrons who make these episodes possible, links to my Patreon and more below. So let's begin with some context. I have been watching RWBY since the Red trailer and engaged with the fandom for just as long. That means I have been present for the constant shifting tides that are people's opinions on Cinder, be they fan or complainer. Cinder has been a lightning rod for complaints and critiques, some of which were both deeply inaccurate and unfair in direction towards her voice actress. This mostly related to accusations she could only do one voice and was only hired because of her looks, both painfully untrue. But Cinder as a character also draws ire in terms of writing. You'll find the pattern of said critiques ranges wildly, however, from Cinder is OP, Cinder is a weakling, Cinder has plot armor to Cinder is an idiot, and so on. Not very consistent, is it? Almost like in some cases people are just looking for something to complain about. Still, there is merit in discussing how Cinder's been handled as a villain, so let's jump back in time to the early days. We'll start in an odd place, being Volume 2's end, as there was a meme back then called "Can't Hinder the Cinder." This ranged from an amusingly joking take to a scornful critique made by those who felt Cinder effectively had plot armor. Some of this was rooted in her being able to pass as a student at a university, her escape during the attack on the CCT, to her being unconcerned by the breach being triggered early. Of these, only the second feels remotely valid to me. The first was addressed by Monty, simply highlighting that she looks young, and as before, this is a university, not a high school. Meanwhile, her relative calm after the breach is pretty easy to explain as both Cinder maintaining her mastermind mystique, but also the fact we don't actually know when said attack was to begin. Most assume during the fall, but it's possible it was meant to strike beforehand to escalate tensions. Even if not, it served to heavily disrupt and disturb the peace, which suited her well, and also meant that many would assume her plan was thwarted, as we see Team RWBY doing in Volume 3. This is what allowed the fall to be such a gut punch to so many. So yeah, shrugging it off when it was one part of a much larger operation and one of the less important aspects is fine to me. Now I'd be remiss not to address the hacking, which I still think is over-critiqued. Some things I liked. Cinder attacked when the CCT was down for maintenance, hence avoiding security cameras, and the fact she had to use a physical medium to infect the system is actually pretty realistic. Adding what we learn about Watts and the fact Atlas didn't discover the code makes sense. Still, the fact Cinder had Neo and could have used her to create a cover and didn't does seem like a huge risk on her part that could have easily blown up in her face. Moving on to Volume 3, the complaints remained much the same up until her defeat, upon which complaints of Deus Ex Machina sung out, which, no. RWBY's silver eyes were highlighted in the first episode, and RWBY opened the volume wondering why Ozpin let her in early. The eyes were Chekhov's gun firing. Still, we are likely seeing the emergence of a pattern, i.e. Cinder going from being seen as OP to only losing because of authorial fire in the eyes of complainers. Many have said people in Volume 4 who would dislike Cinder often talking about how much they liked her more now that she couldn't talk, which is kinda gross, not gonna lie. Suffice to say, they were big mad when she regained her voice. Some argued it made her wounds at the hands of RWBY not matter, but given Cinder's eyes missing along with her arm, I don't think we need to take them seriously. Still, it was in Volume 5 when things shift back into anti-Cinder mode, and this is where I get especially salty. Why? Because RWBY put a lot of effort into setting up this defeat, and I don't see it get nearly as much respect as it deserves. So what actually transpired, and more, what did people take issue with? 1. Cinder questioning why collaborate with Raven when they could take what they want. 2. Cinder going along with Raven's suggested plan of attack over following the plan. 3. Cinder leaving RWBY behind rather than trying to kill her. 4. Cinder losing to Raven in the Maiden Brawl. So let's break these down. Cinder questioning why they are being stealthy makes perfect sense from a character perspective. Cinder isn't just grappling with wounded pride from Volume 3, she is deeply traumatized, wounded, and pissed off. She did everything right in Volume 3 and she still lost. Of course she doesn't trust being cautious or careful when it failed her. Add to that, she now has the power she's been craving this whole time, and so of course she doesn't want to do things slow and steady. Moving on, I will briefly jump to point 3, with Cinder leaving RWBY behind. This makes more sense than I think a lot of people realize, and only makes more sense with time. Yes, Cinder wants revenge on RWBY and more specifically her dead, or at least captured. However, she's still genuinely traumatized by and scared of RWBY. We get to see this in greater detail in Volume 7 with her panicking the moment she might actually have to fight her, so it makes sense this job was left to Emerald. But additionally, Cinder's shift to get to the vault wasn't random. It happened when she realized Ozpin was back. We actually see her beginning to panic here. She's confused how he returned so fast and wary of what it might mean, which, given Salem is paranoid about him and while not aware he has a nuke in his cane, likely knows he has tricks he could pull on if desperate and would have told Cinder as such. Cinder is backing out to avoid unknown risks makes sense, again, especially considering her recent traumas. Now moving back to points 2 and 4. Cinder going along with Raven's plan and the ensuing Cinder Fall. Off the cuff, I'd say it makes perfect sense Cinder would buy someone wants to kill their family, what with her own experience with family and her reaction to Mercury killing Marcus. Plus, Raven is far from an upstanding individual, which helps sell the ruse. More integrally, however, this gives Cinder an avenue for what she wants, namely taking the maiden power, so of course she's going to try for it. And here is where I think a lot of people miss a step, because Cinder's plan worked. Based on the information she had at the time, which unfortunately for her was incorrect, but that's not the reflection of her lack of skills, it was just bad intel that literally everyone believed. I would also add that shock over Raven being the maiden was the fandom response. It was a well executed twist. This now leads us into the maiden brawl, where I think it's worth noting Cinder gave almost as good as she got and nearly took Raven out despite the latter's greater experience. Cinder may have lost, but it was hardly an uneven fight, 60-40 odds in Raven's favour. Beyond that, the rest of the plan going to shit was because Adam was being allowed to run loose and piss off an entire country, which falls on Salem and Hazel for not reining him in. So yeah, it was a well set up set of twists, turns and character beats as far as I'm concerned. Moving on to Volume 6, the complaints remain the usual dull roar of Cinder not being as smart or sexy anymore, the latter of which is meaningless and the former of which, as noted, glosses over the fact Cinder's shift in persona is rooted in trauma and that she is still actually quite cunning. Her actual behaviour in the volume does further demonstrate her continued skills and cunning, which never went anywhere, she just lost the sultry voice. At most, Little Miss Malachite's advice was a good reminder of Salem's own advice in the previous volume, i.e. never underestimate the usefulness of others, hence being more willing to grudgingly recruit Neo despite her vexation and distrust. Going over Volume 7, the main complaints about Cinder regard her impatience, losses, and her treatment of minions. I've already touched on the former with regards to Cinder's anger and trauma from V3 motivating her to be more direct and desperate. While for the latter, I think a lot of people forget that Cinder's always treated her lackeys like shit. Roman was kept in line via intimidation, Adam was recruited via threats, Emerald was consistently having her overtures dismissed and ignored. The one she was nicest to was Mercury. Maybe she saw some of herself in him, who knows. But put simply, the main difference in how she treated her minions is simply that she lacks the sultry voice and is more stressed than in early volumes. But as to her plan, it involved infiltrating Atlas, seeking to steal the relic to get back in Salem's good graces, as well as ensuring that Ruby died while keeping herself safe and gain more maiden powers. This plan didn't go great, in large part because of the inherent weakness of her grim arm and Ruby's arrival, but she did manage to make Ironwood spiral and gave Neo the window to steal the relic. Moving on to Volume 8, we are again get the Cinder is weak and dumb complaints, mostly in relation to her disobeying Salem, going after and then losing to Penny. We are again at a stage of frustration for me because a lot of thought went into this. We've already covered what was motivating Cinder, but why did Cinder lose? Easy. Emerald's semblance doesn't work on Penny the same way it does other people. Penny has systems that Emerald is not aware of and couldn't place her hallucinations over, and thus she could still pinpoint Cinder in what should have been an easy skewering. This means Cinder was in full-on attack mode, justifiably confident Penny would not know where she's coming from, and got blindsided by epic lasers to the face. It's not as complicated as Volume 5, but the reason for her defeat was still well thought out. I should also add just how damned effective Cinder proved against Penny once she wasn't being blindsided by out-of-context attacks. So moving on to her betraying Watson and Neo, which many complain about because they feel she hasn't learned her lesson about the usefulness of others. But she already knew that. She's had minions the whole time. The main thing Cinder adjusted was to use the carrot over the stick even with people she hates, something she doesn't like doing and hasn't meaningfully done with her minions throughout most of the series as previously noted, even back in the early volumes. As to the betrayal itself, it makes perfect sense. Like, it's evil, sure, but she never pretended she wasn't in this for self-serving reasons, at least not to us, the audience. Here's the thing, Cinder and Watts fucking hate one another. That's been obvious since they had their first scene together. What's more, Watts knows she used the last question, and while Salem might not care, Cinder doesn't want to risk it. Killing him off means that no one can challenge her account of events. Meanwhile with Neo, I think a lot of people forget that their partnership started after Cinder proved she was too strong for Neo to kill. However much Neo might have come to seek a potential Torquid replacement in Cinder, I mean, look at the portrait she had of them in the Ever After, Neo was never anything but a rogue element Cinder was directing at someone she hated for her own benefit. So why, after Neo tried to extort her, did Cinder try to kill her? Because Neo tried to extort her, showing she put her own goals ahead of Cinder's. Again, dick move, but not illogical and also in line with Salem's don't put your own desires ahead of mine mantra. Plus, like with Watts, now there's no one to challenge her accounting of events to Salem. The fact that Mercury bailed on her and Emerald did the same even more recently likely also further fostered Cinder's already deeply isolationist personality. But you know, that's just a theory. A Ruby theory. But anyway, yeah, I hope with this I've been able to bring to light the thought processes that inform Cinder's decisions, reactions, and actions, as well as demonstrate the degree of careful thought that went into planning both her victories and her defeats. That's all for now, so thanks for tuning in.